Welcome to the Expanding Consciousness podcast with your hosts, Michael Wally and Nicholas Hart. In this podcast, we explore ways to sharpen our awareness, make life more enjoyable, be a little kinder, become more authentic, less reactive, more present, and ultimately expand our consciousness. We're happy to have you along for the ride, and if you do enjoy these conversations, please leave a review or a comment, as this goes a long way for us. Enough of the promotional talk and enjoy this episode. All right, welcome to the podcast this week. We have a guest again today, Megan Ashton, who is the founder of Unity Breathwork. And she has been facilitating conscious connected breathwork for nearly a decade now, but working in the wellness industry for over 20 years now. She's running retreats, she has a global online practice, and she also leads a 450-hour certified trauma-informed breathwork facilitator training. Sounds like a lot, but I think what I'm especially interested here is the trauma-informed. That's something new I'm seeing, and there's always something I feel is missing with breathwork a lot of the times with the facilitators. So it's great to see that you have that kind of as a central part of your training. So yeah, probably we're going to explore your breathwork that you're facilitating, the training. We also want to learn about your story and your background. But yeah, first maybe Megan, you offered that you want to kick us off with some perhaps conscious breathing.
Yes, I would love that. Hello, everybody. Before we do anything, I would just love it if we could take a few grounding breaths. And if it's possible for you to do this, I'll invite you to blink your eyes closed. And just begin to consciously slow down your breath and focus on bringing it deep down into the belly. Soft and slow, in and out through the nose. Allowing these soft belly breaths to connect you to your inner landscape. Noticing if there's any parts of your body that are a little tense. And offering it the breath. Maybe even placing a hand on your heart as you breathe. And just taking in 2 more rounds of soft, slow, nourishing breaths. And when you're complete, gently blinking your eyes open. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you for guiding that. That is actually a good idea in general. Maybe we should do that before every podcast episode, just to ground yourself.
Yeah, I do it as much for me as for everyone else. So it helps me ground right away.
Awesome. Well, yeah, maybe we start with your story and how you came to breathwork. Even though you're doing it already for a long time, it's always interesting to hear what led you there and into this work.
Yeah, so I think my whole life led me here in a way. I didn't have the happiest childhood like so many of us. And as young as grade 8, I started to run away from my feelings by numbing out through alcohol. And then in high school, I used restricted eating and became anorexic. And then it turned into bulimia so that I could just binge on food for 2 hours or an hour without thinking. And nothing was conscious. I was never thinking, oh, I'm going to use food or alcohol because I don't want to feel my feelings. It was just something in me was like, it's too much, need to numb. So I used these tools, but I was always wellness oriented. I've always been into natural healing. And so there's this like cognitive dissonance where there's this part of me numbing out with these things that I know are so harmful and this other part that really wants to be healthy. So when I was in my early 20s, I got a certificate in holistic nutrition, hoping that would help with the eating, and it didn't. And then I'm a really big believer in working with the subconscious mind. And so I thought, why not become a certified clinical hypnotherapist, and hopefully I can heal myself along the way. And I am a big believer in it still, but not everybody is suggestible with hypnotherapy. And I was one of the people that wasn't suggestible. So then I felt very out of alignment offering it to others when it hadn't worked for me. And so I almost kind of went on a whole adult healing quest for about 15 years around the world, trying everything. I had just received regular talk therapy. I had gotten certified in yoga. I got a Reiki certification. I done about 6 or 7 ayahuasca sessions in the Colombian jungle. And this was about 15 years into my healing quest. And even that didn't work. So at that point, I was like, you know what? I'm a hopeless cause. Nothing's going to work. And then I found myself in Bali about 6 months later, and my friend was like, you should really try this conscious connected breathwork practice, and it was at our favorite yoga studio. And I was pretty skeptical. If I'm honest, my least favorite part of my yoga training was the half an hour pranayama every day because my nervous system was too activated to stop and focus on my breath. My monkey mind was not having it. So I was like, I don't know about this breath stuff, but I do believe in you and my friend, and I trusted her. So I showed up a little bit of a skeptic, but also open. And it was a group session. I closed my eyes. I did the pattern of breathing. And within about 15 minutes, I was in this non-ordinary state of consciousness. And I was just brought back to my little inner child. And I was just bawling my eyes out. I was having the most cathartic cry of my life, just really yearning for love, affirmation, affection, all these things I consciously didn't even know I was missing as a child. And in that moment, I was being really lovingly held by the facilitator and her assistant. They would take turns giving me supportive touch, which was a part of my wounding as well, was a lack of touch as a child. And so it was just the most healing experience. And, I had such a bad experience with ayahuasca, not because I think ayahuasca is bad. I think time, place, setting, all of that. But the medicine wasn't right for me. I wasn't prepared for it. And so when I realized I can go into this non-ordinary state that was so healing and so transformative, and I could do it on my own, and it's my own medicine, that empowerment factor, as well as just the ability to come out of it anytime if I need to, and to feel so differently afterwards. I knew that day that I wanted to train in this and bring it to the world. And I felt changed after just the one session. And I won't say something like, everybody's going to have a life-changing experience on their first session, but I do see it happening quite often. And it can be really just a huge impetus for change. For me, I walked out of there first tired, but the next day after a good night's sleep, feeling just more confident, lighter. There was more colors in the world. It just felt more vibrant. And I just had this sense like, what? I don't care so much what people think about me. I don't need this external affirmation. And I just felt like I was walking through the world in a whole different way. And then within the training, I started to do the breathworks regularly, and the bulimia just lost its hook on me. The alcohol dependency also lost its hook on me. And it was not something that I had to struggle with every day. We always hear the saying, if you're an addict, you're always an addict. But I believe when we start to work on such deep levels with our bodies, with our subconscious, we don't need those coping mechanisms anymore, and they can actually just lose their resonance so that's not a daily struggle. And so that's something so powerful about, this kind of bottom-up work and working with non-ordinary states. And I'm just so passionate about breathwork and bringing it to the world. So that's kind of my story.
Cool. Thanks for sharing. It's very relatable, like what you experienced as we grow up, kind of the numbing that we develop, the substance abuse, using food kind of to distract ourselves from the feeling. All of that definitely rings a bell for me. So for you, it was transformative to have this breathwork session. And was it of the same style that you teach today? Was this conscious connected breathing as well?
Yes, it was. It was the no pause between the inhale and exhale, done with your eyes closed, lying down, guided by music and a facilitator. And there's lots of names for conscious connected breathwork. So anyone who's heard of holotropic or rebirthing or 9D breathwork, or the scientific term now, so if you want to look up research, is high ventilation breathwork. And there's actually studies coming out more and more in the last few years, which really excites me because it brings validation to what I constantly see in my sessions and the changes that are happening. So yes, that is my specialty. In my training, I teach all kinds of breathing practices, but the main focus is the conscious connected breathing, because that's the part where the real changes can happen.
Yeah, interesting. I have the feeling that the breathwork landscape is kind of developing and becoming almost as big as yoga was maybe 10 years ago. And now there's like different organizations which certify, and there's these different camps that are building up. Is conscious connected breathing also the same thing like Wim Hof style breathing? Because that's one that is kind of very popular in Europe.
Yeah, first, I just want to say I love what you just said, because on the day that I decided to get certified, I made it my mission in life to make breathwork as accessible and popular as yoga. And I'm not saying that like I've done this, but just I love hearing that analogy, because I do think we're moving in that direction, and it has grown so much in the last 5 years. And Wim Hof has a role in that, because he's so widely known that he becomes a funnel to get people to my sessions. But to answer your question, it is different with Wim Hof. The typical Wim Hof method is the connected breathing, yes, but then there's intermittent breath holds every, 30 to 40 rounds, is it? And so those breath holds bring you back to a baseline physiology, and you're not going to the really deep, non-ordinary states of consciousness that you go to when you keep the breath connected for a continued duration. People usually reach their greatest depths with conscious connected breath work after about 20, 25 minutes. And that's why for the really big sessions, like if you really want to go deep, you want to do an hour-long session or at least 50 minutes of conscious connected breathing, because you get into that deepest state 25 minutes in, and then from there, that's when most often I see really big emotional releases, physical, energetic tension coming out of the body, sometimes verbal releases. And in the shares, like that's often when the insights come. And that's when most of the benefits start to take place, is in that second half of the session.
Can you maybe describe in a bit more detail for somebody who hasn't done such a breathwork session? Like I remember my first holotropic session, that one lasted even more. I think it was like 3 to 4 hours, something like that, with like the
Yeah.
integration.
Did you
Afterwards, I
guys
was
have a
quite-
sitter in the holotropic and then you swapped
Yes.
places? Yeah.
No, in the holotropic, it was just a one-on-one session. So I had like one facilitator and he was guiding me the whole time.
Okay.
And I thought actually the breathing was very exhausting for me at the beginning. I find it like similar like what you described in your story. I find it somehow related with effort and difficult to do the breathing.
Yeah.
It feels still a bit forced. I don't know if that's like a normal experience, but that was my experience back then. And then obviously what happened were some emotional releases. But yeah, maybe can you take it from there and describe from your experience, what are people experiencing when this starts to happen and unfold?
Yeah. So firstly, holotropic typically is 3 hours. And if you go to a group holotropic, it's at least 6 hours, and they have like a sitter. So just a participant sitting over you, watching over you, and then you swap. So it's usually traditionally at least a 6 hour or a whole day workshop. We're using the same technique as holotropic, but I just find, and most of the schools that are doing conscious connected breathwork now, which is an offshoot of holotropic in a way, don't do more than an hour because it's just not needed. Like so much change can happen in an hour. That extra second and third hour doesn't make much difference. I haven't personally been to an official holotropic, but I've had many of my students who have, and they said that they didn't find it any more beneficial than the 1 hour sessions. And I could see how in your mind, like if you know you have to do it for 3 hours, that's just overwhelming. And the effortful part is something real, but typically, at least in my sessions, it's the first 10 or 15 minutes. And I warn all of my breathers, you're going to get the resistance. The ego's going to try and talk you out of this. An hour of breathing is going to sound like a long time. Your mind's going to say, you can't do this for an hour, can't do it, not working, and give you all the reasons to stop. But usually when people actually continue with the technique in that first 15 minutes, that's when the physiological changes take root. And then there's a redistribution of oxygen in the brain, and then you go into a timeless state. So actually the hour goes by really fast for anyone who's following the technique fully. And by the end of the hour, a lot of times when I'm inviting people to come back, they're like, Megan, we just want to stay out here. Let us be, because they're just in this really deep, effortless state at that point. So often if you can get past that initial hump, it becomes more effortless. I'm not sure what happened in your session and why it felt so long or so effortful, but maybe it's the 3 hour factor. And what was did that answer the question, or was there something more you were looking for me to expand upon?
No, I was just trying to give also listeners who don't have experience kind of a glimpse, like what can it look like? What are the things that can happen? So a lot of times emotional release is what happens for people. Then there's also this phenomena, I think it's called tetany. That was something I experienced. Where I had like the
claw
kind
hands.
of, the claw hands, right? That felt really weird.
They
but
get
it also
locked
somehow,
up,
yeah, but it's also released by itself somehow after some time. Well, what else is there?
So
that
experiences.
People can experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. I often say to people, you can't really explain connected breathwork. You have to try it to fully understand it, because the experiences are so different for every person every time. Just like with any kind of, plant medicine or whenever you're working with non-ordinary states, it can always go in a different way. Every person's always going to experience it differently. Sometimes it's purely physical and you're getting tetany, but also just tension or tingling or tightness or physical releases in different parts of the body. Sometimes it's visual, and people actually do get colorful, psychedelic, fractional type visions. Very often it's emotional, and all the emotions come up. And I really encourage everyone to feel them all without judgment, because most of us have at least one we don't want to feel. And so if we can feel it and breathe into it, we can actually process it and release it. Sometimes it's actually just clarity. Like some people will just get like downloads and insights and so many things coming to them and like new life directions that they have to actually stop in the middle of the session and start writing it down because they don't want to forget. And so I have a pen and paper by everybody's mat, and always at the end of the session, I give them the time to jot things down if they need to, because you are in a non-ordinary state. So when you come back to a normal state, whatever happened might disappear, even if it felt really big. And it's almost, I use the analogy like, having crazy dream happen and you wake up knowing something crazy happened in your sleep. But as soon as you start your day or you look at your phone, it's gone. So you want to write it down before you do anything else while it's still fresh, before you get back into that ordinary state of consciousness and it disappears. But you might go to a session 3 times in a row and just have massive, massive tears. And then you expect that for the next one. And the next one you have bliss and you have peace. You suddenly realize, like, you know what? It's all a joke. None of this even matters. That's a common share I get, which I love because you see how light people look when they're like, okay, this day-to-day stuff I'm stressing about isn't a big deal. What matters is love and presence. And I have both of those within me. And so it really is just so different, but they often build on each other too. And, when you go to, usually people ask me like, how many should I do? And I say, if you're new to it, I would recommend at least 6 to 7 sessions, either weekly or bi-weekly, to really peel back a lot of those layers of the onion. And then to help for those things to actually start to take root, because the brain, the subconscious, the body learns through repetition. And when you do that, you'll also see a shift in your nervous system. Like so many of us are operating with what I say is like a full stress bucket. Maybe we're born with just a few drops from our traumatic birth or from a scary hospital entry into the world. But then each time something happens throughout our life, it gets fuller and fuller. And then as adults, we might get overwhelmed from the smallest thing. Maybe there's just a little bit of traffic on the way to work and you're in like full on freak out mode, like a bear is chasing you because your stress bucket's full. But when you give yourself the space in the non-ordinary state of consciousness with breath to feel these things, to process them, to release them, it's almost like poking holes in the bottom of that bucket so that some of that can drain out. So then your everyday capacity is so much more expansive and you just feel like more patient, more confident, more in flow, a little bit more equanimity around things, a little bit less reaction and more responding. And so the benefits are just so multifactored and it can really be different for every single person. So it's impossible to say exactly what would happen.
I'm kind of curious around like your overall conceptualization of how conscious connected breath work heals people, how it helps people move through trauma. I'm hearing things around like feeling your emotions, processing your emotions, so a few things that come to mind is like, well, does the body keep the score? And do I have to like relive my trauma to actually heal through it? Like what's your conceptual framework that you work from?
Yeah, I'm a really big believer in working with the body. And that's something I love about breath work is, yes, on occasion, some people might go back to a trauma, but they do it in this way where they're feeling empowered because they know they can come out of this state at any time by slowing their breath down. And usually when they do, they gain some sort of processing and like okayness around it or some kind of insight around it so they can move through the world having it with them, but not having it traumatize them. But sometimes what I love about breathwork is you don't need to remember it all. Like a lot of us don't even remember our traumas. And even if you do, you don't have to go back and visit it to actually process what your nervous system is holding around it and to process those triggers and to be able to operate in a different world. A lot of the studies showing on how trauma can make you hyper vigilant and hyper reactive. And the amygdala is always like firing off the emotional and fear response of the brain. Well, when we do conscious connected breath work, we go into a physiological state that's actually quite similar to the states we might go into when we're having a trauma or just an emotionally charged reverse experience. So we're actually going into the sympathetic state, but we're doing it in an empowered and safe way. And that's the difference. And we're choosing. So usually when we're having these adverse experiences, we're just put into fight or flight sympathetic nervous system state. And we're overwhelmed and we often lose our breath. And then there's stuck survival energy in our body because it never fully gets processed or released. So when we can go into a similar physiological state, but do it with empowerment and safety and agency and choice, then we gain access to these things that have been locked in the body, maybe the subconscious mind and the nervous system so that we can process them and just feel lighter. And sometimes the body actually processes, from what I see at least, physically. So sometimes people just come and they feel just physical tension for the whole hour. And even though they don't know what happened, I believe that they are in some ways processing these residues of old traumas, old emotions that are stuck in the body, so they can walk away feeling lighter and having processed it without having to revisit it.
So do you think that catharsis is always part of the healing process? It sounds like, at least with what you're describing around people potentially like getting really tense and just sitting in that for a while, that there might not necessarily be catharsis involved in that. But I'm kind of curious, like your
No, yeah.
perspective around.
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I like to teach is that we hold space for catharsis, but we don't chase it or promote it. And I do see in the industry a lot of facilitators really sensationalizing it. If you go on Instagram, you'll see videos of people screaming and wailing and thrashing around. And it's almost, for me, it's almost like coming from a place of ego that the facilitator needs to see that to feel like something's happening, when in fact, that could actually be re-traumatizing if it's happening because the facilitator is pushing for it. And that can happen. Like sometimes there's not enough agency being given in these sessions. So when the facilitator says, building the breath, breathing more, breathing deeper, someone might already be within, the edges of the window of tolerance, about to go into overwhelm, but they're just listening to the facilitator without even thinking about it. And now they're in a state of overwhelm. And then at that point, that's too much for the nervous system. And they're not going to leave worse off. They could feel more dysregulated after the session. However, I'm such a strong believer in our own inner guiding intelligence, our body's inner wisdom. And so I do believe if emotional catharsis or even physical catharsis wants to happen, then the facilitator should hold space for it with a grounded, regulated nervous system without ever pushing for it or chasing it. So we need to honor each person's capacity. Are they ready for it? And you can deal with a much softer session. Like sometimes when I watch people in the breath work, it looks like they're barely breathing and they're just almost still. And at the end, they just have this most like light and glowing look on their face. And they're just like, I just like feel so relaxed. I don't even know what happened for the past hour, but I haven't felt this good in years. So I really don't think we have to be chasing these big experiences for the healing to happen.
Do you feel like the conscious connected breath work has to be like strong and powerful and forceful to really be effective? Or can it still be effective with like even a much more subtle breath if you're just keeping it connected?
It really is dependent on the person, to be honest. It's interesting. So I always use the analogy in these sessions, the breath medicine. And I tell my breathers, you can choose, you can have a microdose experience. If you want to do that, you just breathe a little softer and slower, but keep it connected and into the belly. And it's going to be much more subtle for you, but it doesn't mean nothing's happening. You could have a macro dose experience or a hero's experience and really take those deep, big, powerful breaths. And for some people, that is what they need. And that gives them these major, like life-changing breakthroughs. But some people are almost like the type A perfectionist where they do everything at 200%. Those people sometimes actually get more benefit from taking the softer approach because that's what their nervous system needs, is to relax into stillness, to be with their feelings on a softer level. And that's where the breakthroughs happen. So it's so different for every person. In general, though, to have like a notable experience that's really going to last and stick, I do typically find people that breathe a little bit more powerful, but it doesn't mean breathing to the point where you're in like full body physical tension and experiencing pain. So I always say it's about being on your own personal edge without going into overwhelm. And it's a really fine balance.
Yeah. Yeah. At what point do you think that trauma happens? Like I heard you mentioned like potential for re-traumatizing in these situations. Is it
Mhm.
that we're going through something really challenging and overwhelming? Is there an aspect of holding our breath that causes trauma to stick? Is it simply going out of our window of tolerance? How do you
Do you mean in
conceptualize?
everyday life or during breath work?
I'd be curious about both and sort of what the parallels are there.
Okay. This is an interesting question. I need to think on this. I think for everyday life, it's really not about the event. Two people can experience the exact same thing, and it depends what their capacity is, what their level of support is. So if it's overwhelming their capacity to cope, typically there's, other things that have already kind of filled up their stress bucket. Now they're overwhelmed and they don't have resources. If you have even just a loved one who can be there for you in this time of this incident, that can really make a difference, as well as agency. Like there's so many stories around, two people being in the same situation. One felt like they could take control and action and they worked towards a solution to get out of it. So they left without trauma because they felt empowered, even though it was a really scary experience. where the other one shut down and felt completely helpless, and then that gets stuck as trauma. And so I think actually these can be paralleled in the breathwork situations, because as far as I'm concerned, when you're working with a truly trauma-informed breathwork facilitator, there is no risk of re-traumatization, because at the center of what they're doing is empowerment for you and giving you the agency and the choice and really encouraging you to listen to it and then noticing and paying attention. You know what it actually does if like they're getting a little bit overwhelmed, I'm going to go and co-regulate with my nervous system, maybe give some grounding touch. Maybe I'll even invite them to open their eyes and orient and be with me just to make sure their nervous system isn't going into overdrive, because that's not what's needed. So I think really the re-traumatization aspect can happen in connected breathwork when the facilitator is chasing catharsis and not giving empowerment and agency. I like to explicitly say in all of my sessions, and I teach my students this as well, before they begin, saying everything I will be saying in the session is a suggestion. Please always listen to your inner wisdom first and foremost. It knows best. So I want people to explicitly know that, because sometimes people's trauma or their heritage teaches them you have to listen to authority. And you're unfortunately in a position of authority as a facilitator or space holder. So sometimes people need that explicit invitation to not listen in order to not listen. And otherwise they're just going to follow and go right outside into that overwhelm. So, yeah.
Yeah. I really appreciate how balanced your approach feels in everything that I'm hearing. So I'm curious to like just get real specific about like, what does trauma-informed breath work look like? I'm hearing things like agency and kind of following and trusting the wisdom of the person's body. Where do you think that distinction is? Like the breath work that really just isn't respecting sort of like the trauma-informed side and like what you're teaching?
Yeah, I feel like I could probably come up with 100 things to speak to. So I'm hoping the
Cool.
most important ones will come here, but there's so many. I think properly preparing people before the session even begins. You know, you had mentioned a tetany. Sometimes I hear people say they went to a session and the facilitator didn't even warn them about the claw hands, which is called medically tetany. And that happens in 70 to 80% of breathers who breathe this way for more than 15 minutes. And it can feel the same as what happens to some people who get panic attacks. Their hands go in that claw shape. So if you don't properly prepare people, say this is something that might happen, then it can be incredibly scary and lead to potentially even a panic attack when it starts to come on. So preparation, we call it the frame. I usually give a 15 to 20 minute frame, which explains not just the technique, but everything that can happen, as well as the accelerator and brake. That needs to be explained in advance. This is how you deepen the experience, breathing faster and deeper. And if at any point, any sensation, emotion, or anything at all feels like too much, you always can use the brake, which really is just softening and slowing the breath. You can also return to the normal breath through your nose if you need to at any time. And when you're ready, go right back in. I preface that in every session. I've only ever had 5 or 6 people out of thousands have to go back to normal breath. And I think because of the safety I create before they go into it, that's what allows them to go to their tender edges and feel safe while doing it. Definitely, yes, the empowerment and agency, but also grounding and integration after. I'm hearing people go into these crazy sessions. There's 100 people in there. There's just one facilitator. No one is there to keep an eye on each of the breathers. And then at the end of the session, they're just like, okay, come back to no breath. All right, get out and drive now. And people are like, what the hell just happened to me? And they're like discombobulated and just like kicked out the door. For me, I would say it's better to have a shorter connected breathwork session so that you have a longer time for grounding and integration. That's so important. At the end of every group session, there's always grounding breaths and at least like 10 or 15 minutes of just coming back music while they're lying down so they can slowly make their way up, time to journal, and then most importantly, in my opinion, time to share. And even in one-on-ones, there's time to share, because when things happen and they don't really make sense, or they do make sense, but for it to really take root, often you need to talk about it and have it be held and heard by somebody else. And I always say in the groups, you know, this isn't a place for you to be offering any kind of advice. I don't want anyone else in the group jumping in with unsolicited advice. We're just going to hold it with our open, loving heart, and we'll take a breath into it. And that can be really grounding and really good for their integration. So I think even integration is a part of trauma-informed care, as well as your own nervous system. I think for any space holder, you need to continue with your inner work. As long as you're alive, there's going to be more layers of the onion. It's not just one and done, now I'm good forever. And you need to show up and be authentic and vulnerable yourself. You can't expect other people to be vulnerable in front of you if you're wearing a mask and you're not authentically you and you're not doing the inner work yourself. You need to ground yourself before you show up for a session, because your nervous system as the facilitator sets the stage for the room. So are you showing up panicked and anxious and rushing around, or have you taken some grounding breaths and time to yourself to show up really grounded and present? Even small details like the room itself. I encourage all of my students to get there really early to the space and set it up. Lay the mats in a nice circular shape, have a centerpiece, have a pen and paper and Kleenex for everybody. Take care of the lighting, make sure there aren't any scents that are going to be allergenic. These little details immediately signal to the nervous system when people enter the room, oh, I'm safe, I'm held. This isn't a chaotic container. I can relax, I can trust, I can feel. So like all the little details and the big details are a part of the trauma-informed care.
Cool. One kind of anecdotal, interesting question came to mind. Do you find that there is problem with Bluetooth in a room full of people breathing very, very heavily?
No. What do you mean? In what way?
So I went through a conscious connected training before, and the guy that was putting it on, he recommended not using Bluetooth. It was, I don't know, something like some sort of static charge in the air that was like produced through the breath work. And he found that Bluetooth would always just kind of get funky and like disconnect. Maybe it was just his like devices
I feel like he
or
was
something.
just using a bad speaker. I've never heard of that. In my 10 years of facilitating and with any of my students or the other schools I've worked for, I've never heard of it. So I feel like he had a funky Bluetooth speaker that needed just fixing.
Cool.
But that's a great question.
Yeah.
Well, speaking about Bluetooth and speakers, you mentioned also touch as an element in your sessions before. I'm curious to learn, like in the beginning of the talk, we talked about all of these emerging breathwork kinds and certifications, and they started combining with also other elements. Like I see one big one in Germany. I think it's called 9D breathwork, where you have kind of headphones on and you kind of shut in during the session. And I believe they have like binaural beats on there. I guess that's the thing. Then other people work with touch. Then I've seen even people that kind of, once the client enters this stage where they're kind of re-experiencing the traumatic experience, they start working with IFS, kind of combining really psychotherapy with it. Over the years, what is your kind of recipe? Do you combine any other things?
Yes and no. So in a way, I'm a real purist. I worked for 8 of the other training schools, including 9D at one point. So I know about all the different things they're combining. But I'm such a big believer in, first, just the power of non-ordinary states and the power of breath, as well as the inner wisdom of each person. And I feel like with certain things, there's just too much direction being given. Like they're saying, okay, now move your body this way to release this trauma. Now move it this way. Where it's like, well, each and every person is going to need something different in this session at any given moment. And moving in that particular way or hearing those particular words that were pre-recorded and aren't spoken live in the moment isn't necessarily what they need. I'm a really big believer in live facilitation whenever possible, and in the facilitator actually doing the inner work to connect to their own intuition, because so often what needs to be said needs to be felt into in the moment. Like I know schools that have scripts for their students, and I think that's really disempowering for the facilitator. And it's missing a lot of, the benefit of what can happen when you're attuned to the group. Even before the session begins, I go around the group and I have everyone share their name and an intention. And I'll take note. If I keep hearing let go or more self-love or continual themes, then I can speak to that theme in the moment and really customize it to what that group needs. But I think when it's already pre-recorded, you're missing so much of that. And I just think too much direction is really, it's almost like the facilitator knows better than the breather. I'd much prefer to say, allow any natural body movements that want to happen as long as you continue to focus on the breath. Allow any vocal releases that want to happen as long as you don't scream. That's one of my rules that I know not all facilitators have, but I find that very dysregulating for other people in the group, especially people that have a hypervigilant nervous system who aren't expecting it. When someone starts screaming bloody murder on the other side of the room, it's too much. So that's one of my rules for safety. And I think the music plays a huge role. So I do incorporate music. I do incorporate voice and the use of words. In some ways, I incorporate IFS. I'm not trained in it, but I just work with parts in a very vague way. If there is a part of you that is feeling unsafe, that needs love or protection, go back to those parts. So I might speak in that sort of way. In a one-on-one, I do an interview in advance, and so I can find out what they want to work on, and I can invite them to work with parts in that way, depending on what they speak to. So I am working with it, but I just try not to be gimmicky with it. I know like some that have, 5 things they use. And I think every connected breathwork does include music. Most include the use of the voice of a facilitator, but not all. And most of them will allow for natural body movements if you're not having to be stuck, but you also don't need to necessarily direct it. And then the headphones and all of that, like I can understand when you're in a big group, sometimes hearing everybody else can take you out of your process. So in a sense, that's kind of nice. But at the same time, on the other side is I almost always hear that the people they were lying next to, hearing them breathe really helped them to charge their breath. And then hearing the people emote actually gave them the permission they needed to finally let go. So there's also something to be said about a group container where you can hear each other, where you're breathing and feeling and releasing together, and the sense of community and connection and oneness that creates.
Yeah, so group setting can also be beneficial as it can kind of uplift everybody in a sense, right?
Yeah. And, there's the neurons mimicking each other. I often see in sessions 2 people who don't even know each other lying next to each other doing the exact same thing, and their eyes are closed. Like their arms are both up in this really odd shape that I've never seen before, and they're both doing it, and I didn't cue it. Or this half of the room is all having a very still, quiet session, and this half is all having loud emotions and moving around and almost dancing. And so there is almost that you can go deeper when your brain is being synced with the people around you. And so it can be a benefit to have the group. And then as far as touch, yes, it's not necessary. We can do these sessions online and people still have deep sessions. And I say, the breath is the medicine first and foremost. So it doesn't need to be in person with the facilitator, but it can be kind of like the icing on the cake. A lot of times, most of us are touch starved as a society. We're not getting touch aside from sexual touch, and the oxytocin and the comfort it can create, as well as just helping people to feel safe in moments where they are on their personal edge, or when they potentially did go back to visit a trauma. To have that grounding touch from somebody else can really help to keep you in your body so that you're not going into a complete overwhelm or starting to actually relive that moment. Instead, you can separate yourself from it. So the touch is really, really beneficial on many levels, but it's not necessary.
Right. We have to recognize kind of also the role that the facilitator has for the client there, especially when working with trauma. Like we analyze like many different frameworks, and also like psychedelic frameworks of how somebody could work with trauma. And one thing that we see emerge is that trauma can also be relational, right? Or it can happen for a person in relation to either the parents or caregivers or whatever. So when this kind of trauma comes up, for example, the framework that we often talk about is the PSIP framework. And they specifically kind of make use of this, that these non-ordinary states can bring people back into their traumatic memories. But sometimes, there's a relational problem going on. So what I'm hearing is when you say touch can sometimes help, do you think that you're kind of taking on the role of the caregiver for the person at that moment? Are you open to kind of, being there for the client and taking on these kind of roles? Or is that something where you say kind of the processing of the trauma needs to happen?
That's a great question. And I actually don't even fully have the answer. I just know that for me, touch is something very intuitive, and it needs to always be done with 2 points of consent. So before the session begins, I give everyone a chance to opt out of touch. And then I let them know if at any time in the session it's just not resonating, please just let me know. I would never be offended. And then from there, I don't actually know what they're processing when I'm touching them. So that's why it's hard for me to say, am I taking on a relational element, almost like what happened to me in my session where it was, I was crying out for my parents' affection and affirmation and touch, and I was getting the touch, and that was so healing. But I don't actually know what's happening in the moment that I'm touching them, but I'm just always watching for signals of nonverbal consent or non-consent. If their body softens and relaxes, if they continue with the breath or they go into an emotional release, that's usually a pretty good sign that it's serving them. If they suddenly tense up, their jaw slack is starts to tighten, they hold their breath, they gasp, anything like that, that's not a good time for touch. I back away. So I'm always looking for these cues. And like 95% of the time, it's almost always positive cues where they just look like really supported by it, and they'll share after, like, you always knew the exact time to touch me. And also, I don't consider myself a healer. I'm not healing anybody. I'm just holding space. So I don't take the responsibility that, they're going through something big here now. They need me to stay with them. No, they also need to learn that they've got this. They can self-regulate and bring themselves out. So I can be with them for a moment if they're having a big release, but I don't need to stay and keep touching them to see it through. I can back away. Once I've let them know I'm here, take a few grounding breaths with them as I'm touching them, then I softly back away and I, watch the rest of the group. So it's not that I need to carry them through whatever it is they're experiencing and be with them by their side. Because I think everyone's really resourceful and whole and complete on their own, and they have the capability to move through these things. And they don't, the message that, I need to be there with you for you to get better isn't the message I want them to have.
Right. Yeah. But we have to understand that people go into a state of high vulnerability. And
Yeah.
I guess that's why we need this kind of trauma-informed container to not just, have these state happen in the presence of anybody, but somebody who
Yeah.
understands like how to navigate it, right?
Thank you for saying that, because that's something I'm so passionate about, is just people are in such vulnerable states in these sessions. Inherently, when you're working with non-ordinary states, you're getting access to the subconscious mind. And this practice is also activating the sympathetic nervous system. So we're working with an activated nervous system. Trauma, grief, all of these big life things we've been carrying our whole life can come up in a session. And so when I see 50-hour trauma-informed, conscious, connected breathwork trainings, it blows my mind. Like, it's so scary to me that anyone can consider themselves trauma-informed and ready to hold space for connected breathwork and for the vulnerability that entails after 50 hours. It's not possible in my opinion.
Right. Maybe we should also talk a little bit, at least, about any adverse experiences or stories. I have the feeling people don't like to talk about this a lot. Similarly, like with psychedelic facilitation, where every now and then there's also death cases. Like, I just recently read about a case in the US that somebody died during MDMA therapy, which is not the kind of stuff we want to hear. We want to hear that it's healing PTSD and like that it's helping everybody. But these things happen mostly because the container, is not right. But there's also, every now and then, there's some kind of rumors around Wim Hof, and that there, have been some kind of adverse cases. But, I never heard anybody confirm it. In your personal experience, and just from what you know from kind of the breathwork scene, do we have adverse events, people getting hurt, something like that?
So I haven't heard of too many, like, aside from people just feeling, really emotionally unstable or potentially off balance and off kilter afterwards. I haven't heard of physical things where people have gone to hospital, stories of that, except I have personally experienced and heard, and no one's talking about this, so I appreciate you asking, seizures happening. And it could be a hypoxic blackout. Sometimes they look the same. And so as a non-medical professional, I can't say. But what happened was, in all of these incidences, I know of 8 now, and no one's talking about this. It was in a connected breathwork session, and it was towards the end. So you're at like 40, 50 minutes of breathing connected. And the person who had the hypoxic blackout or seizure-like event held their breath, and that led them to an oxygen, like a hypoxic state, a low oxygen state. And that's what led to either the hypoxic blackout or seizure. And so this first happened in one of my sessions about 8 years ago. I never cued a breath hold. I never asked them to breath hold. I was inviting everyone to come back to a normal breath. I had a group of about 10. And then suddenly I look over and he's like blue and his lips are foaming. And I go over to him, and he had a seizure that lasted about 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes. And he told me afterwards, I stayed with him afterwards. We chatted for about an hour and a half, made sure he was grounded. And he's like, yeah, I practiced Wim Hof, and I just thought it would feel really good to hold my breath when he said, come back to normal breath. So that's what I did. And so then I started to do research, because no one was talking about this. I didn't know what it was. I didn't even know, is this a seizure? And I actually ended up speaking to a breathwork facilitator who's also a free dive instructor. And he's like, you know what? It sounds like a hypoxic blackout. And this is why we don't allow people to hyperventilate before diving, because it really dramatically increases how long you can hold your breath, which in turn dramatically increases the risk of having a blackout or hypoxic seizure. And the reason for this is the CO2 is actually our trigger to breathe. People think it's just that you have not as much oxygen in your body, but it's actually your CO2 levels. So when you do connected breathing, you're blowing off CO2. So you're reducing your CO2 levels. That's why even after just 2 or 3 rounds of Wim Hof, you can already hold your breath longer after just a few minutes of connected breathing. But every time you do a regular short Wim Hof method practice, you're resetting that chemistry. You're bringing the CO2 back up. So the risk isn't quite as high. But if you decide as a Wim Hof practitioner who's already trained yourself to ignore the alarm bell to breathe, because it's all about breath holding, if you decide to then try to bring breath holds into a long, conscious, connected breathwork practice, that's where the real risk happens. And that's what I've seen. It's happened. I say at the beginning of every class now, like my only two rules are no screaming and no holding your breath on purpose for safety reasons. But I have seen 3 of these happen, all by Wim Hof practitioners who were also athletes, who said they decided that even though I instructed not to, they wanted to hold their breath at the very end. And I have a student that also experienced this in one of their sessions with one of their breathers. Same thing. It's always the athlete Wim Hof holding the breath at the end. And no one's teaching this. And I'm just, if it's happened this many times in my sessions and in my it's happened to a student of mine, it's surely happening in other sessions. And I think people are just brushing it under the rug or like, oh, it's a cathartic release. When actually, I think it's actually so much more than that. The blue face and the blue skin and the lips is not a cathartic release. And interestingly, when it very first happened, the very first time when I was looking into it, the only evidence I could see of this were in YouTube videos of Wim Hof himself guiding what looked like full-length connected breathwork sessions, because he had all the breathers lying down. They were having big emotions. There was music playing, and then it actually was filming, and it actually showed 2 people having seizures on different videos. They've been taken down now. And so I think occasionally maybe Wim Hof at his in-persons might do longer sessions with breath holds. And because it's the longer session, that's when it gets really risky. So I just want everyone to know conscious connected breath work, when you're keeping it connected, as long as you're being screened for contraindications, is safe. But when you try to combine a breath hold into it, that's not safe. And it's just not something worth messing around with, in my opinion.
Interesting. Okay, in this case, I'm really glad I asked that question. Do you believe it's just a combination of those 2 kind of frameworks which shouldn't go together? Because in Wim Hof, usually we don't do it for 30 minutes. We do it for 30 breaths. Yeah,
yes,
right.
Absolutely. Because like I had said earlier, with Wim Hof, the regular Wim Hof method, you're holding your breath every couple of minutes. So as soon as you hold your breath and then you breathe in again, your CO2 has been brought back up. But the longer, I think even after 15 to 20 minutes, your CO2 is already markedly lower. But by 40, 50 minutes, it's just too low. And there's this thing called the Bohr effect. And so that's going to also, your blood's holding on to the oxygen more tightly. It's not being released into your cells and tissues. So you have a higher risk of going into this hypoxic state. I almost think it's the body's way of protecting you. You go into this seizure or blackout because then you come back to the breath. It's like overriding your conscious control before it becomes to the state where it can be so dangerous that there's lasting brain effects. Fortunately, in all of these incidences, the breathers at the end were like, oh no, it felt great. And they weren't even scared. They're like, can I come back? I'm like, absolutely not. And please follow up with a medical professional and get screened to make sure there isn't something else going on. So fortunately, there wasn't lasting damage in any sort of way that we know of. But I think that that's why the seizure actually kicks in, is because they're getting to that state where it could be dangerous for the brain if the oxygen gets any lower. So let's go into this blackout state so the breath comes back.
Right. Well, yeah, that's the thing with Wim Hof breathing, that when you hold the breath, it does feel weird, especially when you do it the first time. There's sort of weird internal sensations, some kind of tingling maybe happening, and it does feel unusual and maybe even scary the first couple of times. But it's interesting to know that it can actually get scary and can get dangerous. I think that's some important information to have. So I appreciate you also sharing, not only the beautiful transformation stories, but also letting us know about these things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think people just go in, if they're already doing Wim Hof, they're going in with the best of intentions. They're just like, this is going to feel nice. Let's see what this feels like. And they don't realize the risk because no one's talking about it. So yeah, I'm always happy to share about that.
Cool. Do you want to maybe share a bit about your own training for breathwork? Because 450 hours is a lot. What does that entail?
Yeah. So the training it's online, and we have an online training platform, and you go through bite-sized videos and written content. I designed it for all learning styles because I have a lot of people with ADHD and with autism and different ways of learning. So I wanted it to be engaging so you can choose. Do I learn better from videos or by copy? And then we meet bi-weekly for Zoom calls to go over the seminar material. And then at the very end of almost a year together, we come together for an 8-day in-person intensive. And that's where everything clicks. All the information you learn online is great, but a lot of it's so much information that it's not fully conscious yet. You've read it, it's there somewhere, but it's not conscious until you start to get that real experiential element where you're in a container where you're breathing every day and offering sessions and supporting others while they offer sessions, and then having constructive feedback and practicing touch too. especially like so many people in our society are scared to use touch because of just the implications nowadays. And so having that container to practice giving and receiving touch for 8 days, my students get so much more comfortable with it. 450 hours is a lot, and I actually think it's necessary. I think you should at least choose a school that's 400 hours. We have the Global Professional Breathwork Alliance, the GPBA is our closest thing to a governing body, which is trying to make this industry a little bit safer. It's really the Wild West because it blew up so fast that it's not fully regulated yet, unfortunately. But if you're thinking about a training or even just doing a session, you can go on the GPBA website and you can find a facilitator who's certified by them. And look for a facilitator that is trauma informed. And mine, I think a lot of schools might just like use that word for marketing hype, which is kind of sad, but it's truly woven into every thread. Every seminar of my training is trauma informed. Our entire approach is all about agency, empowerment, safety, working with tools such as titration, pendulation to really ensure that each breather is having a safe experience, and screening. You know, if you have a session you're signing up for and they don't even have you sign or read a waiver and don't prepare you with an email on how to get the most out of this session, and they don't offer aftercare support, these are red flags.
Great. I love that you just decide by yourself to kind of improve the facilitation and the access for everybody and try to make it trauma informed, even if there's no governing body telling you should do it. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Not yet. We're moving in the direction, hopefully. Like I'm hoping one day, that the Yoga Alliance, which is basically governing the yoga trainings around the world, will be similar to the Breathwork Alliance. But because it blew up so fast, people just don't know what to look for. And I think a lot of people, like students, they're just, they're passionate about the breath. So they just join a training and they don't realize, 200 hours isn't enough or 50 hours isn't enough. So they're just not aware. So I'm trying to just increase awareness because I have heard so many stories from people that come to my sessions of experiences that just were way less than ideal and potentially scary and just left them not better off. And so that's why I just kind of became passionate about it. I never chose it. It just kind of found me when I kept hearing these stories. Like, we really need to increase the safety in this industry and awareness around it. It's such a powerful tool, but I think with anything that's powerful, there's a lot of responsibility that comes along with it. And people might just say, oh, it's only the breath. It can't be dangerous. It's absolutely dangerous. There's so many contraindications that people don't know about. I have 29 on my glossary online of contraindications so far. And it doesn't mean you can't necessarily do the practice, but it means your facilitators should know because they might need to modify it to keep you safe.
Well, Megan, I appreciate you sharing all of this with us. This was really in-depth. Like, I think we learned a lot about breathwork itself, and like we're always looking for what is the thing about the framework, that really moves the needle for people, that brings transformation. And it sounds like people can find it definitely with this kind of breathwork. So yeah, thanks for sharing.
Thank you. And yeah, I don't know if I mentioned, but just if anyone wants to look it up, it's Unity Breathwork. And I have my training page on there, as well as 3 retreats a year. And I offer online sessions. I actually have a free online session happening September 27th. And I do those a few times a year as well. So if anyone wants to breathe with me, there are opportunities. Thanks so much, Nick and Michael.
Cool.
Thank you.